Okay, so the purpose of this video is going to say, okay, let's bring the two halves of the supply and demand model together. Okay, so we've got demand on one side, and what did we say about the law of demand? We said that the demand curve will be downward sloping because as the price goes up, the quantity demanded is going to go down. So we set up this relationship where when the price goes up, the quantity goes down. When the price goes down, the quantity goes up, as illustrated by this line. Okay? Now, the same thing applies to supply, the other side of the equation. So within a market, this is a market, and within the market, there are two sides. There are people who consume and there are those who supply. And it should not be any surprise to anyone that the law of supply is that as the price goes up, the quantity that we're willing to supply increases. A lot of these things are where all other things remain equal. So if my costs remain the same, but yet the price I'm able to get for my goods goes up, my profit goes up. So my incentive to produce more goes up. And then you find that we have this magic place in the middle where buyers and sellers meet. And that is known as our equilibrium. So the quantity at equilibrium and the price at equilibrium. So the interaction of these two curves will eventually cause this equilibrium to exist, right? If our price was below the equilibrium price, if for some reason the price went down like this, well, then we would, follow our dotted line over to our demand curve, and we would find a quantity demanded here. We would continue to follow our line, our quantity supplied is right here, quantity supplied, and then we would follow it over to our demand curve over here, and here's our quantity demanded, right? So in other words, what are we saying here? At this low price, everybody wants this thing. All these people want this thing. But at this price, only this number of people are willing to supply it because, the cost of producing. If the cost of producing remains the same, as the price goes down, it becomes harder and harder to make a profit. So less people are willing to supply. So you've got this gap in between what's demanded and what's supplied. So we call this a shortage, right? Shortage. And we can quantify that shortage. That is QD minus QS equals shortage, right? In this case, at P1. QD minus QS equals shortage. If those were numbers, we'd be able to calculate the amount of the shortage, the number that we are short. Now, really what's going to happen in a market is where there's a shortage, you've got all these people to sell to and nothing to sell them. So eventually these people are going to be willing to pay more. This is scarce. They're looking for it. Their willingness to pay goes up. As the willingness to pay goes up, as the price goes up in the market, there's more that's able to be supplied, and that's going to cause pressure, which is going to lead us up to this falling into this market equilibrium. Let's say we set a price that was too high. Let's say that the government comes in and sets a price that's high like this, sets a price floor. The price cannot fall any further than this. Well, what happens? We follow our dotted line over to find our quantity demanded here. Here's our quantity supplied, right? So in between here and here, what we have is the opposite. It's a surplus, specifically a market surplus. right? What this means is that we've got a bunch of stuff sitting on our warehouse shelves and nobody wants to buy it because the price is too high. Well, what's going to happen then? What happens when there's a whole bunch of stuff sitting on the shelves? Well, we start to cut the price. We start to discount it. That brings more people, induces more people to purchase until we fall into this market here. So that puts pressure on the price downward. So when we have plenty of something, the price is, relative to the demand, then the price is forced downward. And so that's generally what's going to happen there. Now, we did mention the special circumstance where the government sets one of these, right? So that's a fixed line, right? The government says the price can't be any lower than this. Well, you've got your demand and your supply not really meeting up. So you create a market surplus, a bunch of things decaying on warehouse shelves or whatever it happens to be. One of the examples that they often give is in the labor market, like a minimum wage. So the suppliers of labor, you and me, are more induced to supply our labor as the wage goes up. Well, and the demanders of labor, our employers, our businesses, have less incentive to purchase our labor. So, when we have a minimum wage, the idea is supposed to be, or has been introduced in the history of our lives and in our politics, where people don't really look at it too closely. We've got, it creates what would be a surplus in the labor market or causing in unemployment. And then, you see the opposite, which would be down here, price ceiling, right? The government says, okay, well, the price can't go any higher than this. This is why maybe a little bit of why, when we have inflationary times, you might say to yourself, well, why can't the government just come in and cut the price? Well, what classical economic theory would tell you is that would create shortages in the market. You drive the price low, artificially low, below the equilibrium price, and here you wind up with people who are not willing to supply something that is demanded, right? You create scarcity, and then the market doesn't have the flexibility to allow it to go up or down when you have these government imposed, so we'll call this price floor and price ceiling, right? So if these are government policies, then the market is not allowed to operate in the most efficient way, because right at this point of equilibrium is where we achieve allocative efficiency. Right? We're going to see a little something about market failures before, but like this point of equilibrium, right? That's called equilibrium in the market. That is where buyers and sellers have met in the middle. And so what is offered for sale is purchased. It's basically a market imbalance. So that in classical economic theory is what we call that. So we pay a lot of attention in markets to what's going on surrounding this equilibrium. Either we're looking at government policies that may impede the market getting to this equilibrium, or we might look at this equilibrium, and in a lot of the problems you're going to get, and this is what the next video will be about, we will maybe move one of these curves in order to see what happens to the equilibrium itself. This equilibrium would change. Remember from our first lesson that a change in the price by itself just moves us along these curves. But we have other things. We call them the determinants of demand. There are also determinants of supply, which could move one or both of these curves, and that will have an effect on this equilibrium quantity and price. So we'll look at that. We'll have a look at that next, because that's really key to understanding all this.